it's time that we wrap up archetype analysis for another longer bit, as we will be taking a look at a new archetype. I believe it's also from Age of Overlord, called Memento, which consists of corrupted versions of very old vanilla monsters, some of which have appeared and were used in the anime. So that kind of makes them eligible for this archetype analysis. And yeah, a rather interesting archetype, kind of a pseudo fire king, Lightsworn-esque kind of deck where they focus on destroying themselves. Yeah, scraps are also what comes to mind. So yeah, it's a very interesting concept, and yeah, we will be taking a look at them. And before we do that, we first have to take a look at the vanillas which inspired each and every single one of its members, except their boss monster, which we'll get to later. We have Goblin Calligrapher, which we've taken a look at in the Goblin archetype analysis. Then MACE, a level 1 monster which was used by Team Taiyo in 5Ds. And then the two OCG exclusives, FAIRYWITCH and Tatsunoshiko. And lastly, the level 8 Trihorn Dragon, which appeared in 5Ds when it was used by Yusei during his duel against the Facility Chief. And yeah, the only reason I'm mentioning them is simply to mention them, because every monster, with the exception of the boss monster, is based around one of them. So let's get into the archetype proper, starting with the level 1 Memento Goblin. Same stats as Goblin Calligrapher and level. And during the main phase, if you control a Mementoral Tectolica, the Nether Skull Dragon, quick effect, you can discard this card. Your opponent cannot target Memento monsters you control with card effects this turn. During your main phase, you can destroy one Memento monster you control, and if you do, send up to 2 Memento cards with different names from each other from your deck to the graveyard, except Memento Goblin. You can only use each effect of Memento Goblin once per turn. Yeah, the monster it mentions is the archetype's boss monster, and yeah, there are several cards whose effects specifically revolve around that monster, so yeah. Anyway, as for Goblin himself, well, he does a reasonable job protecting the boss monster only. No, wait, he protects all monsters, sorry, but you need the boss monster present in order to trigger this effect, which can be kind of annoying, because you won't always have him ready on your field. And the second effect is essentially graveyard setup, which is needed to summon the monster, meaning you have to get this guy onto the field beforehand, which is easy. He's a 1-for-1 target after all, he's a Dark Fiend. And yeah, it's an okay card, and definitely worth running at least 2 of these. Next up, we have their other and final level 1, Memento Mace. During your opponent's main phase, if you control a Mementoral Tectolica, the Nether Skull Dragon, quick effect, you can discard this card and target one face-up monster your opponent controls, take control of it until the end phase. During your main phase, you can destroy one Memento monster you control, and if you do, add 1 Memento card from your deck to your hand, except Memento Mace. You can only use each effect of Memento Mace once per turn. It's a searcher, it's as simple as it goes, and if you happen to be controlling the boss monster, you also get a Change of Heart for the price of a discard. And yeah, pretty good. Definitely a much better card than Memento Goblin, but again, both are good, even though this one tends to be a slight priority because it's a searcher, and searchers are always the name of the game in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Next up, we have Memento FAIRYWITCH, a level 3 spellcaster with the same stats as FAIRYWITCH, and if this card is normal or special summoned, you can add 1 Memento monster from your deck to your hand, except Memento FAIRYWITCH. You can target 1 level 2 or lower Memento monster in your graveyard, destroy 1 Memento monster you control, and if you do, special summon the targeted monster. You can only use each effect of Memento FAIRYWITCH once per turn. It's your other and better searcher, and suffering the case of a Schrodinger's effect, as it also affects level 2 Memento monsters, of which the archetype has none of. And yeah, again, it's a really good searcher, it's a spellcaster, meaning you can actually resummon it with Magician's Restage if you ever so feel like running it. So yeah, it's a definite 3-off staple in the archetype, and nothing much else to say besides, yeah, it's a good card. Next up, we have our first level 5, Memento Tatsushinoko. I hope I pronounced that right. If you control no face-up monsters other than Memento monsters, you can special summon this card from your hand. During your main phase, you can destroy one Memento monster you control, and if you do, send any number of Memento monsters with different names from each other from your deck to the graveyard whose total levels are less than or equal to the destroyed monster's original level. You can only use each effect of Memento Tatsunoshinoko once per turn. Yeah, I'm gonna get tongue-wrapped easily. And yeah, this is a much better graveyard setup card than Goblin, as you essentially get to special summon him for free, using its own effect, and then set up the graveyard for the boss monster, which we'll talk about in a minute. And yeah, it's a good extender, and it's overall a decent starter for the archetype because, yeah, of course it is. It special summons itself for free. It's a level 5 monster, meaning you get to pop it instantly in order to dump at least 4 Memento monsters. 5 if you're dumping their boss monster for whatever reason, and yeah, it's a good card to consider. Next up, we have Memento Horn Dragon, based of course on Tri-Horn Dragon. And if you have 3 or more Memento monsters with different names in your graveyard, you can special summon this card from your hand. You can only special summon Memento Horn Dragon once per turn this way. If this card on the field is destroyed by a card effect, you can target 3 face-up cards on the field, including a Memento card you control, destroy them. You can only use this effect of Memento Horn Dragon once per turn. This card is absolutely insane, as in it has a really good destruction effect, which can even be triggered if you destroy it with your own card effects, which is really good. I would be very confused if it didn't trigger with your own effects, because this archetype does tend to have effects to pop their own monsters, as we've seen so far with their lower level monsters, and we'll see more of that as we go further along the archetype. Has a pretty sweet summoning condition. Basically, if you open up him and the previous monster, you instantly guaranteed to have Memento Horn Dragon on the field up and running. Very Judgment Dragon-like summoning condition, and yeah, it's also a level 8, it's a Dark Dragon, it's a trade-in and a lure target, so yeah, this is an all-around an amazing card for such a very small and compact archetype, and should always be ran at 3. And next up we have their final monster, the before mentioned Mementorial Tectolica, the Nether Skull Dragon. It's a level... wait, which level is this? I'm not good at counting. It's a level 10, sorry. Worm monster for some reason, with 5,000 attack and defense, which cannot be normal summoned or set, and must be special summoned from your hand or graveyard by shuffling 5 other Memento monsters with different names from your hand and or graveyard into the deck or extra deck. If you control no other monsters, this card can attack all the opponent's monsters once each. Once per turn, if your opponent activates a card effect, you can special summon a Memento monster from your hand or graveyard. Yeah, it's a boss monster in its purest definition. Extra large attack, attacks multiple times, super easy to summon, well, relatively within its own archetype. And yeah, it swarms the field, although the second effect honestly confuses me a bit. I'm on and off about this. On one hand, why doesn't it negate the effect that the opponent has activated? It would make the card a little bit better, but on the other hand, if they also gave it a monster effect negation on top of everything else that it has, it would be a bit too much. And yeah, it has no built-in protection, but hey, Goblin is here to save the day when necessary, and he's also easily searchable. It's a bit of a bummer that he's an Earth monster for some reason, we're making the usage of Allure of Darkness a bit of a tricky endeavor. But yeah, it's your main guy you go into. It's relatively easy to summon, and yeah, you definitely go all out with it, or you don't go at all. Simple as that. Next up, we move on to their back row, and we start off with the field spell Nether Skull Temple Mementoran. If your Memento monster battles, your opponent cannot activate spell or trap cards until the end of the damage step. If a monsters you control is destroyed by battle or card effect, you can target one of them, special summon one Memento monster with a lower level from your hand or graveyard, and you can only use this effect of Nether Skull Temple Mementoran once per turn, and once per turn during the end phase you can target a Memento spell or trap in your graveyard and set it. it recycles back row, turns all your monsters into ancient gears because, yeah, Mementoral Tectolica wasn't simply good enough as it is. And not to mention, you can recycle a Memento if it gets destroyed by battle or card effect. However, I do have a slight issue with this effect, and it's essentially the same issue I have with Vampire Genesis, as in it only works on lower level monsters, meaning you're going to, with the size of this archetype specifically, you're going to run out of monsters to cycle through very quickly, unless this archetype gets some support later down the line, or you make some workarounds. Still, it's a field spell in its purest form and definitely worth running at least 2 copies of this. Next up, we have one of their 2 quick plays, Memento Bone Party. Destroy 1 Memento monster in your hand or face-up field, and if you do, take 1 Memento monster with a different name from your deck and either add it to your hand or special summon it in defense position. During your main phase, you can banish this card from your graveyard and target 1 Memento monster you control. If it attacks a defense position monster this turn, it inflicts piercing damage to your opponent. You can only use each effect of Memento Bone Party once per turn. Another searcher / special summon from the deck, and it's pretty good because, yeah, it does require a sacrifice from the field in order to be made, but hey, you're basically used to destroying your own monsters at this point, so why not go all out with it some more to provide some additional field presence. The second effect is only remarkable if you use it on their boss monster and nothing else, because, I mean, yeah, it's sure piercing damage. Their boss monster and Trihorn Dragon are the only legitimate beatsticks, and yeah, they're the only monsters on which this effect is somewhat usable. So yeah, save it for the boss monsters and definitely run 3 of them because of the first effect. So yeah. Next up, we have their final spell, the other quick play, Memento Boneback. If a face-up Memento monsters you control leaves the field because of an opponent's card, special summon 1 Mementoral Tectolica, the Nether Skull Dragon, from your hand or deck, ignoring its summoning condition. If your opponent moves a Memento monster out of your graveyard while this card is in your graveyard, you can banish this card and special summon as many Memento monsters as possible with different names from your hand and or deck. You can only use each effect of Memento Boneback once per turn. Okay, so the first effect is really good, and yeah, it special summons the boss monster ignoring the summoning condition, basically on a very, very easy to fulfill condition. And not to mention, the second effect would be better if it wasn't for the fact that it's literally never gonna go off, because if your opponent knows that this thing is in your graveyard and he literally won't go to manipulate your graveyard while he sees that you have this in your graveyard, because it's, like I said with the ancient gear frame video, and like Rada said, the same as me in the when talking about ancient gear frame. It's like the equivalent of a bear trap politely begging you to step on it. Like, literally nobody is gonna fall for that unless you have some way to manipulate the effects of what the opponent does. If you force them to basically banish your stuff from the graveyard or something like that, and the opponent does it out of necessity, and then they get a nasty surprise with this thing's second effect. So yeah. Anyway, on to their traps. We start off with the continuous trap, Memento Cranium Burst. While you control a Memento monster, your opponent's monsters that can attack must attack the Memento monster you control with the highest attack, their choice if tied. When your opponent activates a monster effect on the field, you can target 1 Mementoral Tectolica, the Nether Skull Dragon you control. It loses exactly 1000 attack and defense, and if it does, negate the activated effect, and you can only activate this effect of Memento Cranium Burst once per chain. So yeah, this is essentially made to make up for the boss monster's inability to negate effects itself, but this is at the cost of losing attack points, which is not too big of a deal. But again, if you make too many negations at once, you will leave your boss monster at rock bottom attack value where anything can run over it. And not to mention, the first effect essentially makes all your opponent's monsters crash into your boss monster if you have it out, or Trihorn Dragon, and yeah, it can be pretty nasty if you force them to attack the highest attack monster. You can also, this also makes some valid tech choices such as all-out attacks or Battle Mania to really shine in this combination if you don't have this ready online, since again, the boss monster is just that impressive. And yeah, run a couple of these definitely. And the final card we have for today is Memento Fracture Dance, a normal trap where if you control a Memento monster, you get to target one card on the field, destroy it. Then if you control a Mementorial Tectonic and the Nether Skull Dragon, you can destroy one more card on the field. And when an attack is declared involving your Memento monster and an opponent's monster, you can banish this card from your graveyard. All face-up monsters your opponent currently controls lose 1000 attack until the end of this turn. You can only use each effect of Memento Fracture Dance once per turn. It might not be too impressive, but it's actually is a decent target, if anything, for Foolish Burial Goods to ensure those big numbers OTK attacks to go through, since it is a rather chunky attack drainage on all of the monsters, and the first effect can be useful in a pinch, so there's definitely room for one or two of these in your deck. Alright, so that's the whole archetype. Now it's time for the grading. In terms of consistency, they do have some solid searching options. There's Memento MACE, then there's Memento FAIRYWITCH, which are both searchers in monster form, and then we have the Quick Play Bone Party, which is also a searcher which relies on you destroying your own stuff. Which makes it not so live as it can potentially be, but definitely live enough for me to give it a solid 2 out of 3 in this regard. Power gets a very fat 3 out of 3 simply because of how good the boss monster single-handedly does things in this archetype, and I would give it a 5 if I could. And yeah, it's a very respectable power output for such a small archetype. Comeback ability gets a 2 out of 3. There is some comeback ability potential in some of their back row, but one of those cards is Bone Back, and yeah, the second effect is very rarely going to go off, and the first effect is again, it requires you to have an established field in order for that effect to be live. But then again, it special summons a 5k beatstick if it goes through, and the condition to fulfill is relatively easy to fulfill, and the field spell can also recycle said back row, so it's definitely not the worst. Protection only exists in form of Memento Goblin, which is okay, but definitely not enough for me to warrant anything past a 1 out of 3. The archetype definitely needs more protection, which is really the case with aggressive decks such as this one. They have an absolutely amazing offense, but their defense could use a little tweaking. It's very rarely that I find a good aggressive deck to have godly protection, or at least very formidable protection, as well as their attack power. And as for the versatility, it's also pretty much a 1 out of 3 because they're not very splashable in anything besides their own playstyle, which they are. I mean, they have sizable support, but they're still not enough to be used perfectly solo in tandem. I mean, yeah, generic support is always they're always going to be played with generic support such as Allure of Darkness and other stuff which supports Fiend, which are some of the Infernoid cards. And yeah, that's about the extent of the versatility, which doesn't make me go anything above 1 out of 3 to be a reasonable choice. Overall, this is a rather interesting archetype. Like I said, it's a very small and compact archetype, but it packs a punch like a archetype that usually has like insane combos to get to such a high attack beatstick, while this archetype can with relative ease shit it out on turn 1 or 2 and sit on it with some protection, very minuscule protection, and then call it a day. And then once turn 3 rolls around, it OTKs then and there. So yeah, it's a rather interesting specimen, and I would actually be interested to see what kind of support it receives in the future, because since it's based on old vanilla monsters, it would be really cool to see which vanilla monsters they pick. I personally love to see some of these old vanilla monsters revitalized to serve such a role. I mean, Dark Witch is actually a very nice candidate to see in this archetype, because that's a rather interesting monster to see and pleasant in a way. Anyway, that is it for the Memento archetype, and only God knows when the next archetype analysis will be. I'm still waiting for some anime adaptations whenever we'll get to that. There's still a handful of anime archetypes which still haven't been adapted, mostly from Reigns, like Storm Riders, Drones, Armatos Legio, and all those. Yeah, I personally love to see Armatos Legio. It's one of my most desired archetypes to receive a printing. So yeah, besides the Fortune Lady support, wink wink. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned for more Racebook News and updates. Have yourselves a great day, and I will see you all next time.